Every night, right before sleep takes over, there's a moment where your mind goes quiet. That's the moment I'm here for. Welcome back to Sleepy Shadows, stories built for exactly this second, right before you drift. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Leave it in the comments. I always check. If this has become part of your nightly routine, subscribing means you'll never lose it. Now, close your eyes and let your mind go quiet. This story isn't really the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. If anything, it's a little funny looking back on it now. At the time, though, I had absolutely no idea what was going on, and it's still the most vivid, unexplained experience I've ever had. It happened when I was in middle school. I was part of a play, and we were in the middle of rehearsals. We had spent weeks practicing the same scenes over and over, and by that point, everyone knew where they were supposed to stand, when they were supposed to speak, and where to move during each scene. The theater had become a second home for a while. Most rehearsals lasted for hours. We'd joke around between scenes, help each other remember lines, and then quickly switch back into character whenever the director called us back to the stage. One rehearsal started out exactly like every other. Nothing unusual happened during warm-ups. Nothing seemed different about the building. Everything felt completely normal. We were in the middle of rehearsing one of our scenes when I suddenly felt something against the back of my neck. It was so clear and distinct that I reacted instantly. It felt exactly like someone had leaned in until their face was only an inch away from me and gently blown a stream of cold air across the back of my neck. Not a breeze, not air conditioning. It felt personal, like someone was standing immediately behind me. I spun around almost without thinking. The only person beside me was the girl standing to my right. She looked completely confused. She hadn't moved. She wasn't close enough to have done it even if she'd wanted to. She just stared back at me with an expression that seemed to ask why I'd suddenly turned toward her. I looked around the stage. No one else was anywhere near enough to explain what I'd just felt. For a moment, I wondered whether I had imagined it. Maybe there had been a draft. Maybe the theater's ventilation system had suddenly turned on. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. So I tried to ignore it, only it didn't stop. The sensation came back. Again, it felt exactly like someone quietly blowing cold air onto the back of my neck. Not constantly. Just enough that I couldn't convince myself it had only happened once. Each time, I'd instinctively glance over my shoulder. Each time, there was no one there. The rehearsal continued. Everyone else remained focused on their lines. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual. Eventually, the strange feeling changed. Instead of cold air against my neck, I began feeling something touching my leg. More specifically, it felt like someone was flicking it with their finger. Not hard enough to hurt, just a quick little tap. Then another. It was exactly the kind of thing a friend might do to annoy you during rehearsal, except no one was close enough. I looked down. Nothing. I shifted my feet. The feeling came back. By that point, I was becoming genuinely distracted. I was still trying to perform the scene while silently wondering why it felt as though someone invisible had decided to keep bothering me. I remember thinking how ridiculous the whole situation was. If I said anything, people would probably assume I was joking, so I kept quiet and tried to finish the rehearsal. Then something happened that everyone nearby noticed. The girl standing to my right was holding her script. She wasn't waving it around. She wasn't adjusting her grip. She was simply standing there. Without warning, her script suddenly flew out of her hands, not slipped, not fell. It shot several feet through the air. I'd estimate around 2 feet, maybe a little more. Everyone saw it. She hadn't thrown it. Her hands hadn't made any sudden movement. One moment she was holding it, the next it was airborne. The rehearsal stopped for a moment while everyone reacted. People looked around, trying to figure out what had happened. The girl looked just as surprised as everyone else. No one seemed to have an explanation. Strangely enough, after that, everything stopped. The cold breath disappeared. The flicking sensation on my leg ended. Nothing else unusual happened for the rest of rehearsal. Once the scene was over, I realized how shaken I actually was. During everything that had happened, I'd been too busy trying to stay focused to fully process it. Now that rehearsal had paused, the whole experience suddenly caught up with me. I decided to ask the director something I'd never imagined asking anyone. I walked over and said, "Is this place haunted?" I expected her to laugh, or tell me not to worry, or explain that old theaters have strange drafts and creaky floors. Instead, she answered in the calmest, most casual voice imaginable. Of course, I blinked. She continued as though she'd just been asked what time rehearsal ended. Theaters are always haunted. She wasn't joking. There wasn't even a hint of surprise in her voice. To her, it sounded like common knowledge. Then she started listing experiences. She talked about apparitions that other actors had reportedly seen over the years. She mentioned guests who claimed to have heard voices when nobody else was in the building. She described people feeling someone brush past them backstage. Others had reported footsteps, unexplained sounds, or the sensation that someone unseen was standing nearby. She rattled off the stories so casually that it almost made my own experience seem ordinary. I didn't know what to say. Part of me was relieved that I wasn't the only person who had experienced something strange there. Another part of me became even more unsettled, because she seemed completely convinced the theater had a long history of unexplained activity. I've thought about that rehearsal many times since then. There are certainly ordinary explanations for parts of it. Old theaters often have unusual air circulation. Ventilation systems can create unexpected drafts. Standing still for long periods can make you notice sensations you would normally ignore. Even the script flying through the air might have had some explanation that nobody noticed in the moment. I understand all of that. I'm generally a skeptical person. Whenever I hear stories about haunted buildings, I usually assume there's a reasonable explanation hiding somewhere behind the mystery. But I still remember exactly how those sensations felt. The cold breath was unlike any random breeze I've experienced. It genuinely felt as though someone was standing right behind me. The flicking on my leg felt just as deliberate. Neither sensation resembled a draft or a shifting current of air might. Then there was the script. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. What has stayed with me almost as much as the experience itself was the director's reaction. She didn't seem surprised in the slightest. She didn't ask me what I'd experienced. She didn't question whether I was mistaken. She simply accepted the possibility, as though old theaters collecting strange stories was the most natural thing in the world. Whether that's because she'd heard so many stories over the years, or because she'd experienced something herself, I never found out. I've never had another experience quite like that one. I've been in plenty of theaters since then. Most have felt completely ordinary. Nothing has ever repeated those strange sensations from that rehearsal. Even now, I'm not sure what I believe happened. Maybe everything had a perfectly normal explanation that just happened to occur at the same time. Maybe my imagination filled in details after the fact. Or maybe there really was something unusual about that old theater. I can't honestly say. What I do know is that, out of all the strange moments I've experienced, This remains one of the clearest, not because it was especially frightening, not because it changed my beliefs, but because I can still remember exactly how it felt to stand on that stage, convinced someone was only inches behind me, quietly blowing cold air across the back of my neck while no one was there. And when it was finally over, the only explanation I was given came from the director, who answered my question with complete confidence and almost unbelievable calm. Of course, theaters are always haunted. Whether she meant it literally or was simply repeating a bit of theatrical folklore, I still don't know, but hearing that there were so many other stories connected to that building made it much harder for me to dismiss my own experience as nothing more than imagination. Even now, whenever I walk into an old theater, I can't help remembering that rehearsal and wondering how many stories every stage quietly keeps to itself. When I was around 7 years old, my family and I visited the Winchester Mystery House. I was still young enough to be fascinated by places with unusual histories, even if I didn't fully understand why everyone spoke about the house with such curiosity. I remember feeling excited before we even went inside. The building looked unlike any house I had ever seen. Every hallway, staircase, and doorway seemed to come with another strange story, and our tour guide talked about the history of the house as we followed the rest of the group from room to room. There were quite a few people on the tour with us. We all moved together at a slow pace while the guide pointed out different features of the house and explained why they were considered unusual. Like most kids my age, I wasn't paying attention every second. Sometimes I'd listen closely, and other times I'd get distracted by something nearby. At one point during the tour, we entered a room with a particularly interesting feature. You could actually look through part of the floor and see into the room directly below us. I remember stopping for a moment to look down through the opening while everyone else continued moving forward. I ended up near the back of the group. There was only one person behind me. As everyone slowly made their way toward the next room, something else caught my attention. There was an open window nearby. For whatever reason, I wandered over to it. Maybe I wanted a better view outside. Maybe I was simply curious. I honestly can't remember why. I just remember placing both of my hands on the open window while I looked outside. Everything was perfectly still. Then, without warning, the window slammed shut. It happened incredibly fast. 1 second, it was open. The next, it crashed closed with enough force that it nearly caught my fingers. I jerked my hands away at the last possible moment. If I had reacted even a fraction of a second slower, my fingers probably would have been trapped between the window and the frame. My heart immediately started pounding. At 7 years old, it scared me badly. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the window, trying to understand what had happened. I don't remember anyone standing close enough to close it. I certainly hadn't moved it myself. The whole thing happened so suddenly that I barely had time to react. Before I had even fully processed what had just happened, something else drew everyone's attention. A few seconds later, we heard people shouting from below. The room beneath us was part of another tour. One of the doors on that lower level had suddenly opened by itself. Several people screamed. The noise echoed through the house. Everyone on our tour looked down toward the commotion. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire house had come alive. The adults around me seemed just as surprised as I was. Some laughed nervously. Others looked genuinely startled. As a child, it all felt incredibly convincing. Between the window nearly shutting on my hands and the door opening on its own only moments later, it was easy to believe I had just experienced something paranormal. The rest of the tour continued, but those 2 moments stayed with me much more than anything else I saw that day. Years passed. As I got older, I started looking back on the experience differently. Children often accept unusual things at face value. Adults tend to ask more questions. The older I became, the more I wondered whether there might have been perfectly ordinary explanations for everything that happened. The Winchester Mystery House is one of the most famous, supposedly haunted locations in the country. People visit because of its unusual architecture, its history, and the stories surrounding it. With that in mind, I've often wondered whether some of the strange events people experience there might actually be intentional. Maybe there are hidden mechanisms that occasionally open doors. Maybe certain effects are built into the tour to surprise visitors. After all, unexpected moments make memorable experiences. From a business perspective, I can understand why attractions sometimes include harmless surprises that encourage people to talk about their visit afterward. At the same time, one part of my experience doesn't fit comfortably into that explanation. The window, if the window had really been part of some planned effect, it came dangerously close to slamming on my fingers. That seems like an enormous liability. I can't imagine any business intentionally creating something that could seriously injure a visitor, especially a child. Even a minor injury could easily result in complaints or legal problems. That's why I've never fully settled on one explanation. Perhaps it was nothing more than a strong draft. Old buildings are known for unpredictable airflow. Doors opening and closing elsewhere in a large house can sometimes create sudden pressure changes that move nearby windows. It's entirely possible that something like that happened. If so, the timing with the door opening below may have been nothing more than coincidence. That explanation honestly makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I can't deny how vivid the memory still feels. I can still remember the sudden force of the window snapping shut. I can remember pulling my hands away just in time. I can remember hearing people scream from the tour beneath us, only moments later. Whether those events were connected or completely unrelated, I have no way of knowing. I've gone back and forth over the years. Sometimes I think it was simply an old house behaving like old houses often do. Buildings shift. Windows move. Air pressure changes. Doors open unexpectedly. None of those things are impossible. Other times, I remember how strange the entire sequence felt while I was standing there. As a child, it genuinely seemed as though something unseen had moved through the house just ahead of us. I don't claim that I encountered a ghost. I don't even know whether I believe that's what happened. If anything, I'm more skeptical now than I was back then. Still, it's one of those memories that has never completely left me, because I can't confidently explain every part of it. Maybe the Winchester Mystery House includes clever little surprises that make the experience feel more mysterious. Maybe the timing of everything that happened was simply an extraordinary coincidence. Or maybe I experienced exactly what so many visitors hope to experience when they walk through those old halls. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that, even after all these years, I can still picture myself standing at that open window with my hands resting on the frame, only to have it slam shut without warning just inches from my fingers. I can still remember my heart racing as the sound echoed through the room, followed almost immediately by frightened voices from the tour below, after a door suddenly opened on its own. Whether it was nothing more than the quirks of an old historic house, a carefully planned illusion, or something far more difficult to explain, it's an experience I've never been able to completely make sense of. Even now, I sometimes find myself wondering whether anyone else who has visited the Winchester Mystery House has walked away asking the very same questions. About 7 years ago, my family moved into a very old house. It was the kind of place that immediately felt different from newer homes. The floors creaked beneath almost every step, the doors never seemed to close quite right, and every room carried the unmistakable feeling that countless people had lived there long before we ever arrived. The property had quite a bit of history too. Long before it became the 1-acre lot we owned, the land had once been part of an enormous ranch that stretched across roughly 1,000 acres. Over the years, different owners gradually sold off sections of the property until only a small piece remained. By the time we moved in, all that history had been reduced to a single old house sitting quietly on 1 acre of land. Even without knowing every detail of its past, the place always had an unusual atmosphere. I wouldn't necessarily call it haunted. It was more of a feeling. The house often felt older than its age somehow, as though it carried memories that had settled into the walls over generations. Visitors occasionally mentioned that it felt a little eerie, especially at night. Still, nothing ever happened that made me think there was anything genuinely paranormal. For the first few years, life there was completely ordinary. The creaking floors became familiar. The strange sounds of an old house eventually blended into the background. I stopped noticing most of them altogether. Then, about 3 years after we moved in, something happened that I still haven't been able to explain. It was a quiet day. I was sitting alone in the living room, relaxing and looking out through the back window toward the yard. From where I was sitting, I had a clear view of the garden. Someone was out there. At first glance, I assumed it was my sister. The figure appeared to be bending over the vegetable garden, picking vegetables one by one. Nothing about that seemed unusual. People were often outside working in the garden. I only watched casually for a few moments before something began to feel slightly off. I looked more carefully. The person didn't seem to be dressed the way my sister normally would while working outside. Instead of jeans or gardening clothes, she appeared to be wearing an elegant dress. It looked almost like a ball gown. The longer I watched, the more it reminded me of a wedding dress. It wasn't dirty. It wasn't practical. It looked completely out of place in the middle of a vegetable garden. For a few moments, I simply sat there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe my sister had been wearing something unusual. Maybe I was mistaken. Distance can play strange tricks on your eyes. Then the figure noticed me. She turned. Our eyes seemed to meet through the window. There wasn't any threatening expression, no sudden movement. She simply turned toward me, then she walked away. What happened next was the part that made the entire experience impossible to forget. Instead of opening the gate or walking around the fence, she continued moving straight toward it. She passed directly through the fence, not over it, not around it, through it. As she disappeared beyond the fence, every vegetable she had supposedly been carrying suddenly dropped onto the ground along the fence line. One moment she was there. The next, she was gone. The vegetables remained scattered where they had fallen. I sat there for a moment, trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. Nothing about it had felt dramatic. I hadn't experienced overwhelming fear. I hadn't felt threatened. If anything, the whole moment had been strangely calm. It was simply confusing. I eventually went outside to look around. The yard was quiet. There was no one there. The fence was exactly as it had always been. The garden looked normal. The vegetables that had seemed to fall near the fence were there, just as I remembered seeing them. Who or what I had been watching, I couldn't say. Afterward, I naturally tried to think of ordinary explanations. Perhaps I'd mistaken someone else for my sister. Perhaps the distance and the light had distorted what I thought I was seeing. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that simply wasn't obvious in the moment. Those possibilities all crossed my mind. None of them completely explained what I remembered seeing. The image itself remains surprisingly clear. A woman in what looked like a ball gown or wedding dress, quietly picking vegetables in the garden, looking toward the house after noticing me, walking straight through a solid fence, leaving the vegetables behind. I've told the story to friends over the years. Interestingly, I'm usually less unsettled by it than they are. Whenever I describe it, they're often the ones who react with disbelief or discomfort. Some immediately decide it must have been a ghost. Others insist I must have imagined it. I don't argue with either opinion. The truth is, I don't know. The experience never felt threatening. There wasn't any sense of danger. I didn't feel watched afterward. Nothing else strange followed. Life in the house continued exactly as it always had. The old place still creaks. The atmosphere still feels a little eerie at times, just as many old houses do. But I've never seen the woman again. Whatever happened that afternoon remains a single, isolated memory. Sometimes I wonder whether the history of the land has anything to do with it. After all, a property that old has undoubtedly seen generations of families come and go. People lived there, worked the land, planted gardens, celebrated milestones, and eventually moved on. Perhaps my mind simply blended that history with an ordinary glimpse of someone in the yard. Or perhaps old places occasionally leave behind moments that don't fit neatly into our understanding of the world. I honestly don't know. I still consider myself a fairly rational person. I don't automatically assume every unexplained event is paranormal. Most unusual experiences eventually turn out to have ordinary explanations. This one, though, has always stayed with me because I've never managed to find one that fully satisfies me. Whenever I think back to that afternoon, I don't remember fear. I remember quiet. I remember sunlight falling across the garden. I remember looking out the living room window and assuming I was watching my sister harvest vegetables. Then I remember realizing that the woman in the garden was dressed in what looked like a ball gown or a wedding dress, clothing that made no sense for the work she appeared to be doing. Finally, I remember watching her calmly turn toward me before walking straight through the fence, as though it simply wasn't there, leaving the vegetables scattered along the fence line behind her. Whether I witnessed an ordinary event that my memory has transformed over time, a trick of distance and perspective, or something that can't easily be explained, I honestly have no idea. Whatever it was, it never made me feel threatened. It simply left me with one strange memory tied to an old house built on land that had witnessed far more years of history than I'll ever know. Even now, when I look out toward the garden, I sometimes find myself remembering that quiet figure in white and wondering who she might have been. Many years ago, my family moved into an old farmhouse. I was only about 3 years old at the time, so most of my earliest memories come from stories my family later told me, mixed with the few things I can still remember myself. The house was incredibly old. It had been standing for generations, and you could tell the moment you walked inside. The walls weren't built the way modern houses are. They were made from hand-split timber boards, and over the years those boards had been covered with layers of newspaper, hessian, wallpaper, and countless coats of paint. Every room seemed to carry traces of the people who had lived there long before us. To my father, though, it was simply an old house. He was a complete skeptic. As far as he was concerned, ghosts, hauntings, and anything paranormal were nothing more than stories people told because they wanted to believe in something mysterious. If anyone mentioned spirits or haunted houses, he would usually laugh or make a joke about it. Because of that, My mother rarely talked about the strange experiences or beliefs that existed on her side of the family. It wasn't until I was well into my 20s that she finally shared many of those stories with me. I grew up with my father's skeptical outlook. Even today, I naturally look for ordinary explanations before considering anything supernatural. Still, there are a handful of experiences from that old farmhouse that I've never been able to explain. The strangest of them all began when I was 3 years old. Not long after we moved into the house, I suddenly developed what everyone assumed was an imaginary friend. According to my mother, I had never had one before. She wasn't especially concerned because lots of children invent imaginary friends. It's generally seen as a normal part of childhood, something that fades away on its own. Mine, however, wasn't an imaginary child. It was an elderly woman. I described her in remarkable detail. She always wore a long black dress with a high neckline. Her hair was white and pulled into a neat bun high on the back of her head. At the center of the collar on her dress was a distinctive white horse brooch. Whenever I talked about her, I simply called her my lady in black. On its own, none of that seems especially unusual. Children have vivid imaginations. They invent people, animals, and entire worlds. If the story had ended there, I'd probably dismiss it the same way everyone else did. But there were other moments that became much harder to explain. One happened when I was about 4 years old. At the time, I had been sick. My mother had put me to bed and expected me to stay there while she got on with things around the house. At some point, she realized I wasn't where I was supposed to be. She searched my bedroom. Then the rest of the house. She checked every room she could think of. Apparently, she became increasingly worried because she couldn't find me anywhere. She even looked under the beds. She searched inside wardrobes. She was just about to leave the house and start looking outside when she happened to glance through the kitchen window. There I was. I was up in the paddock with my father while he was filling the water trough. She could see us clearly. About half an hour later, my father and I came back to the house. According to my mother, I stopped just inside the kitchen doorway. I tilted my head slightly, looking upward at something she couldn't see. Then I looked back at her. I asked why she had been looking inside the wardrobes for me when I had been with Dad. She froze. There was no reason I should have known where she had searched. I looked upward again for a moment, then back at her. "I'm sorry I scared you," I said. My mother asked how I knew she'd been worried. I answered as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. The lady in black told me. Then I started listing the places she'd searched before she finally looked through the kitchen window and saw me outside with my father. Every place I named was somewhere she had actually checked. No one had told me. No one else had been there. Yet somehow I knew exactly where she'd looked. That story stayed with my mother for years. There were other moments too. I remember telling her that my lady in black came to my bedroom every night to say goodnight and tuck me into bed. Oddly enough, I actually remember that part myself. Not the woman herself, more the feeling. Whenever she was there, I felt calm, safe, comforted. I also remember hearing my mother and father talking together in the living room while I lay in bed. It all felt perfectly normal to me. Years later, I discovered that I wasn't the only child in the family who claimed to experience strange things in that house. My sister admitted that she also had experiences there. Today, she's deeply religious, and she believes the old farmhouse was demon-possessed. She even believes I was possessed as a child. One night, after she'd had a little too much to drink, she began telling me stories about things that had happened while we lived there. Some of them I had completely forgotten. Naturally, I didn't simply accept everything she said. Instead, I asked other members of the family. To my surprise, they confirmed many of the events she remembered. One story in particular has always puzzled me, because I honestly have no memory of it happening. According to my sister, there were times when I'd be sitting quietly in the living room playing by myself. Without warning, the wooden floorboards would begin vibrating. Everyone else in the room could supposedly feel the vibrations through their shoes. The strange part was where those vibrations stopped. If someone walked toward me, the vibration would suddenly disappear once they reached about a 1-meter radius around where I was sitting. Outside that invisible circle, the floor vibrated. Inside it, everything was perfectly still. Apparently, people even experimented with it. If they stood with 1 foot inside the circle and 1 foot outside it, they could feel the vibration only through the foot that remained farther away from me. That sounds completely unbelievable. If anyone else told me that story, I'd probably dismiss it immediately. The strange thing is that when I eventually asked my father about it, he didn't laugh. He didn't tell me everyone had imagined it. He simply said he didn't want to talk about anything weird that had happened in that house. Coming from someone as skeptical as him, that answer surprised me more than any confirmation would have. Personally, I don't remember the vibrating floorboards at all. The only thing I vaguely remember is members of my family occasionally walking around me in circles. At one point, I apparently became annoyed and asked my sister whether she was doing the hokey pokey. You put your left foot in, you put your left foot out. That was the only way my young mind could make sense of people repeatedly stepping toward me and then backing away again. No one ever explained why they were doing it. As I got older, I gradually stopped talking openly about the lady in black, mostly because my father clearly disliked hearing about her. Even as a child, I could tell the subject made him uncomfortable. I didn't stop noticing her entirely. I just stopped mentioning it around him. Occasionally, I'd quietly acknowledge her presence to my mother instead. She was much more willing to listen. Then, when I was around 8 years old, something happened that completely changed the way my mother looked at the whole situation. My father began renovating the inside of the farmhouse. Part of the work involved removing the original hand-split timber walls that had been hidden beneath layers of newspaper, hessian, wallpaper, and paint for decades. While taking one of the walls apart, something unexpected fell out. An old photograph. My mother told me about it years later. The photograph showed an elderly woman. She had white hair arranged in a high bun. She wore a long black dress with a high neckline. At her collar was a white brooch. She looked almost exactly like the woman I had spent years describing as my imaginary friend. My description of the lady in black had never changed. I had even drawn pictures of her over the years. Naturally, my father insisted it was just a coincidence. According to my mother, he immediately pointed out that I had always described the brooch as a white horse. From where he stood, the photograph only showed what looked like a small white shape. So he fetched a magnifying glass. He examined the photograph more closely. Then something unexpected happened. Without saying much, he put down both the photograph and the magnifying glass, muttered a swear word, and walked out of the house. My mother picked up the magnifying glass herself. Looking closely at the photograph, she could clearly see the brooch. It was a white horse, facing exactly the direction I had always said it faced. When my father eventually came back inside, he insisted once again that it was all just a coincidence. He never changed his position, at least not out loud. The following day, after my father had left for his afternoon shift, my mother decided to try something. She gathered a collection of old family photographs, many from around the same period as the newly discovered picture. She mixed the photograph from inside the wall among all the others. Then she spread them across the kitchen table before I came home from school. When I walked through the door that afternoon, I immediately noticed the photographs. Without hesitation, I walked straight over to the table. I reached down, picked up one photograph, and held it up. It was the picture from inside the wall. I looked at my mother and asked a simple question. What was her name? I told her this was my lady in black. I actually remember that moment. I remember feeling excited because after all those years, I thought I was finally going to learn who she was. No one had pointed out the photograph to me. No one had suggested which one to choose. I simply recognized her. After that, things slowly changed. The lady in black didn't visit as often anymore. I don't know why. Maybe I simply grew older. Maybe childhood imagination faded with age. Or perhaps finding her photograph somehow marked the end of whatever connection had existed between us. I've wondered about it many times over the years. Sometimes I think opening the wall and uncovering that hidden photograph somehow released her. Other times, I wonder if I simply reached an age where I stopped noticing whatever I had once believed was there. I honestly don't know, even now, after being raised by a father who questioned everything and becoming a naturally skeptical person myself, I still don't know what to make of those experiences. Children can imagine extraordinary things. Memories become unreliable over decades. Families unintentionally influence one another's recollections. I understand all of that, and I think those possibilities deserve serious consideration. But there are still parts of this story that quietly resist every explanation I've been able to come up with. The details I consistently described before anyone found the photograph, knowing where my mother had searched for me when no one had told me, my father's unusual refusal to discuss the strange events in the house, despite spending my entire childhood dismissing anything paranormal, none of those things prove that ghosts exist. They don't prove that my lady in black was anything more than an unusually vivid childhood memory. They simply leave me with questions I've never been able to answer. All these years later, I still picture her exactly as I always described her. An elderly woman dressed in black, her white hair neatly gathered into a high bun, a white horse brooch fastened at the collar of her dress, quietly appearing at bedtime, with nothing more than a comforting presence. Whether she was an imaginary friend created by the mind of a lonely 3-year-old, a coincidence that grew larger with time, or something that once lingered within the walls of that old farmhouse, I honestly don't know. I only know that after her photograph emerged from behind those old walls, I never seemed to see my lady in black the same way again. About 4 years ago, I had an experience that completely changed the way I look at anything connected to the paranormal. Even now, I still don't know exactly what happened that night, but it was enough to make me swear I'd never mess with anything related to ghosts or the occult again. It all started late one evening when I was watching ghost videos on YouTube just for fun. I didn't really believe most of what I saw. Like a lot of people, I watched them because they were entertaining, not because I thought they were necessarily real. Partway through one of the videos, the creators started talking about a ghost hunting app. It was a sponsored segment, and they claimed the app could communicate with spirits through text messages while also highlighting paranormal figures that appeared in the camera. The whole thing sounded ridiculous to me. Since it was clearly an advertisement, I assumed they were only saying those things because they were being paid to promote it. I figured the app was fake and designed to make money from people who believed in the paranormal. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I decided to download it myself. I wanted to see how obviously fake it really was. After installing the app, I opened it and pointed my phone around my bedroom. At first, nothing happened. Then I slowly aimed the camera toward my closet. Almost immediately, the app indicated that something was there. According to the app, there was a ghost standing inside my closet. I expected it to outline some vague shape on the screen, the way it had in the advertisement, but instead, something much simpler happened. A single word appeared. Hi. That was it. Just one short message, as though something was trying to start a conversation. I rolled my eyes. To me, it only confirmed what I already believed. I assumed the app randomly generated messages to make users think something paranormal was happening. I wasn't impressed. I closed the app, uninstalled it from my phone, and got ready for bed. As far as I was concerned, the whole thing was nothing more than a gimmick. I climbed under my blanket, turned off the lights, and went to sleep, duck and dus. Not long afterward, I woke up. At first, I couldn't explain why. The room was completely dark and silent. Then I noticed something that immediately made me uneasy. I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. The air around me seemed noticeably colder, even though I was completely covered by my blanket. I kept my eyes closed. For some reason, I didn't want to look. I can't really explain why. It was just an instinct. The feeling that someone else was in the room became stronger with every passing second. It didn't feel like I was alone anymore. Then something even stranger happened. Although I'm deaf, I experienced what felt like a voice speaking directly inside my mind. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was more like words appearing clearly in my thoughts, as though someone standing beside my bed was communicating without actually speaking. The message was simple. Don't put your feet outside the blanket. The thought repeated itself with surprising clarity. At the same time, I felt an almost irresistible urge to stretch my legs. It was strange, because the warning and the urge seemed to conflict with each other. Part of me wanted to keep my feet safely under the blanket. Another part felt compelled to move them. Without really thinking about it, I stretched my feet until they slipped out from beneath the blanket. The moment they did, something grabbed them. The grip was sudden and incredibly strong. Before I had time to react, I was being pulled. Everything happened so fast. I was dragged off the bed before I could fully understand what was happening. My body hit the floor as I desperately reached for anything nearby that I could use to defend myself. The first object my hand found was a pair of Chinese chopsticks. Without thinking, I gripped one tightly, ready to stab whoever had grabbed me. My heart was racing. I looked up. There was no one there. The room was completely empty. No person. No shadow. Nothing standing over me. I was alone. For several long moments, I just stared around the room, trying to understand what had happened. The silence felt overwhelming. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. As I slowly looked around the bedroom, my eyes settled on the closet. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I had the unsettling feeling that whatever had grabbed me had been trying to pull me in that direction. I can't prove that. It's simply the impression that stayed with me afterward. Whether it was my imagination trying to make sense of what had happened, or something else entirely, I don't know. I never saw anyone. I never saw any figures standing near the closet. I only knew what I had experienced. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the app. Earlier that evening, I had laughed at it and dismissed it as nothing more than an advertisement. Now I found myself wondering whether using something intended to communicate with spirits, even if it was only a novelty app, had somehow invited something into my room. I know that sounds irrational. In fact, part of me still believes there must be some ordinary explanation for what happened. People can experience vivid sensations while falling asleep or waking up. Fear can distort memories. The mind is capable of creating experiences that feel completely real. I've considered all of those possibilities many times. Even so, that night affected me deeply. whether the app had anything to do with it or not. The experience was real enough that I never wanted to take chances again. It also changed the way I think about objects and activities associated with the paranormal. Before that night, I didn't pay much attention to things like spirit communication or occult games. Afterward, I became much more cautious. To me, it felt as though deliberately trying to contact something unknown, even through something that seemed harmless, wasn't worth the risk. It reminded me of how people often talk about Ouija boards. Some believe they're just games. Others believe they're invitations. Before my own experience, I would have dismissed those warnings without much thought. Now, I simply choose not to get involved. If someone invited me to play with a Ouija board or experiment with anything connected to the occult today, I would politely decline. Not because I can prove any of it is real, not because I think I understand what happened that night, but because I experienced something that frightened me enough to leave a lasting impression. Maybe there is a perfectly logical explanation hidden somewhere in the details. Maybe the timing with the app was nothing more than coincidence. Maybe what I experienced happened entirely within the strange space between sleep and wakefulness. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I have no desire to test those possibilities again. Looking back after all these years, I still remember the sequence of events with surprising clarity. Watching ghost videos late at night, downloading an app I was convinced was fake, seeing the word "hi" appear while pointing my phone toward my closet, uninstalling the app without another thought, and then waking to the chilling feeling that someone else was in the room. Whether any of those events were truly connected is something I'll probably never be able to answer. But ever since that night, I've stayed away from anything that claims to communicate with the paranormal, right or wrong, real or imagined. That single experience was enough for me. I made myself a promise that night, and I've kept it ever since. I won't knowingly invite the unknown into my life again. My parents have always loved collecting old glassware. Over the years, they've built up quite a collection, especially milk glass and colored glass pieces. It's become one of their favorite hobbies, and somewhere along the way they came up with a tradition for all of their children. Each of us was assigned a color. Whenever they found a nice piece in that color, they'd add it to our collection and give it to us at Christmas. They started doing this when I was a teenager. I'm 22 now, so after several years I've accumulated quite a few pieces. Naturally, my parents let me choose my own color. Being a teenager at the time, I picked black. It seemed like the obvious choice. Last Christmas, they gave me several beautiful black glass pieces. Most of them were packed away because my life was a little chaotic at the time. I was moving from place to place and didn't really have anywhere permanent to keep fragile glassware, so I left everything carefully packed in the trunk of my car. One piece in particular stood out. It was a black glass bowl. At first, I didn't think anything about it. It simply stayed in the trunk with the rest of my belongings while I figured out where I was going to live. Then, something strange started happening. Every time I drove, it felt like someone was trying to hit my car. I don't mean once or twice. It happened constantly. Cars would drift into my lane. People would pull out in front of me. I'd narrowly avoid accidents that didn't seem like they should have happened. Near misses became so common that I started expecting something dangerous every time I got behind the wheel. It reached the point where driving stopped feeling routine. I was constantly on edge. Of course, I tried to explain it away. Maybe I was just having an unlucky streak. Maybe I was driving more because of all the moving around. Maybe I was simply noticing close calls more than usual. Those explanations made sense. Still, The pattern felt unusually persistent. That black bowl stayed in the trunk for around 6 months. During those months, the close calls never seemed to stop. Eventually, I moved in with my sister and her family for a while. Finally having somewhere stable to stay, I began unpacking everything from my car and carrying it into my room. Before I go any further, there's something important to understand about my niece. She's 6 years old now. For reasons none of us can explain, she's had some remarkably strange experiences over the years. On 3 separate occasions, she's correctly identified pregnancies before anyone else knew about them. Twice, she casually told someone there was a baby, and those people went home, took pregnancy tests, and discovered they were pregnant. The third person already knew she was expecting, but hadn't told anyone yet. My niece looked at her one day and simply said, "There's a baby in there." The secret didn't stay secret for very long after that. Experiences like those made the entire family pay closer attention whenever she said something unusual. She also refuses to sleep without an eye cover. According to her, she sees things at night. She's only 6 years old, but because of everything that's happened, our family jokingly, and perhaps not entirely jokingly, refers to her as something of a medium. Whether that's true or not, I honestly don't know. I only know that she's said enough unusual things over the years that people tend to listen. The room I stayed in at my sister's house was upstairs. From the doorway, I had a clear view of the staircase. I could also see the hallway leading toward both children's bedrooms as well as my sister's room. Not long after moving in, I started noticing something odd. Late almost every night, usually around 1 in the morning, I'd hear footsteps. Then I'd catch sight of what I assumed was my nephew quietly walking downstairs. He looked exactly like you'd expect. About 4 feet tall, dirty blonde hair that almost looked brown depending on the lighting. He moved silently down the staircase toward the kitchen. Naturally, I assumed he was sneaking downstairs for candy or a late-night snack. Kids do things like that. Sometimes I'd wait a minute before following him. Each time I'd reach the kitchen and find nothing. No nephew. No open cupboards. No signs that anyone had been there. I assumed he'd heard me coming and hidden somewhere. After all, children can be surprisingly good at hiding. This continued for several nights. Eventually, I brought it up during dinner. I casually asked my nephew why he kept sneaking downstairs in the middle of the night for snacks. He immediately denied it. Not the kind of denial where someone is trying to avoid getting into trouble. He genuinely looked confused. He insisted he'd never done that. While we were talking, I noticed my niece. She had gone completely quiet. Her eyes were wide. She didn't say a single word at the time. I didn't think much about her reaction. I simply assumed my nephew either didn't remember or didn't want to admit it. Life continued. Then a few other strange things happened around the house. Nothing dramatic. Just enough little moments that made everyone a bit uneasy. One day, completely out of nowhere, my niece suggested burning black candles to cleanse the house. Hearing a 6-year-old casually recommend cleansing rituals was unsettling enough by itself. I honestly don't remember how that conversation even started. It simply came out of nowhere. The strange activity continued for about another week. Then one morning, I was asleep when my bedroom door suddenly burst open. My sister and my niece rushed into the room looking genuinely terrified. I had barely opened my eyes when my sister asked, almost shouting, "Did you just hear that?" Still half asleep, I had no idea what she was talking about. I asked, "Hear what?" She looked completely shaken. "A little boy was standing in my doorway," she said. "He screamed, 'Look at me.'" Before I could even process what she'd said, my niece spoke up. "Yeah," she said. "I heard it too." She explained that after hearing the scream, she'd met my sister outside her bedroom. The two of them immediately checked on my nephew. He was still asleep in his bed. He hadn't left his room. After checking on him, they'd come straight to wake me. The whole experience unsettled everyone. Until then, I'd mostly convinced myself that everything I'd seen had ordinary explanations. After hearing that both my sister and niece had experienced something at the same time, it became much harder to dismiss. Later that day, I started thinking about the black bowl. For months, I jokingly blamed it for my terrible luck while driving. Now I couldn't stop wondering whether bringing it into the house had somehow coincided with everything that had been happening there. Was that logical? Probably not. Did I care at that point? Not really. I picked up the bowl and threw it away that same day. After the trash was collected, everything stopped. No more footsteps. No more little boy walking downstairs. No more strange experiences. The house went back to feeling completely normal. I've questioned it many times since. I've asked my sister whether she and my niece were just trying to scare me. Every time they tell me the same thing. No, they insist the little boy really appeared in the doorway. They insist they both heard him shout. They've never changed their story. Even now, I don't know what actually happened. Maybe the bowl had absolutely nothing to do with it. Maybe everything was an extraordinary coincidence. Perhaps my own expectations caused me to connect unrelated events into one story after the fact. Those explanations are entirely possible. I'm generally skeptical of haunted objects and cursed antiques. I usually assume there's a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be found. Still, I can't ignore how strange the timing was. The near accidents while the bowl stayed in my trunk. The unexplained footsteps after it came into the house. The little boy I repeatedly mistook for my nephew. My niece's unsettling comments. My sister and niece both hearing the same impossible voice. Then everything ending shortly after the bowl was thrown away. Whether any of those events were actually connected, I'll probably never know. Looking back now, there's one part that still makes me laugh despite everything else. If I had truly believed the bowl was haunted, throwing it away was probably the least profitable decision I could have made. In hindsight, I probably should have sold it. I'm almost certain someone would have happily bought an old black glass bowl with a story about it being haunted. Whether they would have been purchasing an ordinary antique or something much stranger is impossible to say. All I know is that ever since that bowl disappeared, so did every unexplained thing that had been happening around me. Coincidence or not, I haven't been tempted to collect black glassware ever again. vidIQ. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Sleepy Shadows for daily calm horror stories made for late nights and sleep. You can also turn on notifications so you don't miss a new story when the night gets quiet and the shadows return. Now, let's continue. A few years ago, a friend and I decided it would be interesting to use a Ouija board in a cemetery. Looking back, I'm not sure what we expected to happen. Whether you believe Ouija boards actually work, or think they're nothing more than a game, the idea seemed exciting at the time. We were curious, and curiosity was enough to convince us it was worth trying. So one evening, we took a Ouija board to a local cemetery. The place was quiet. There wasn't much noise beyond the occasional breeze moving through the trees. The rows of headstones stretched out in every direction, and aside from the two of us, there didn't seem to be anyone else around. We found a place to sit and placed the board between us. At first, nothing happened. We asked a few questions, mostly half-joking, not really expecting an answer. Part of me assumed we'd sit there for a while, laugh about how nothing happened, and then head home. Instead, the planchette began to move. Very slowly at first. Then, more deliberately. Neither of us believed the other was pushing it. In fact, that was what unsettled us the most. We both immediately became suspicious of each other, but neither of us admitted to moving it, because as far as I know, neither of us was. The piece continued sliding across the board. I can't honestly say whether something paranormal was happening or whether we were both unconsciously moving it without realizing it. I've read enough about the ideomotor effect to know that's a real possibility, but in that moment, sitting in a quiet cemetery after dark, logic didn't feel particularly convincing. We were both completely unnerved. After a while, we decided we'd had enough. Neither of us wanted to keep sitting there any longer. So we packed everything up and started walking back toward the cemetery entrance. We were mostly quiet. I think we were both replaying what had just happened in our heads. Then something caught our attention. Off to one side, a single headstone seemed to be glowing. It wasn't glowing brightly enough to light up the entire cemetery, but it stood out immediately because we were certain we hadn't noticed it when we first walked in. We stopped. Both of us looked at it for a moment. Then, despite being more than a little uneasy, we decided to walk over and see what we were actually looking at. As we got closer, it became obvious that the glow wasn't coming from the stone itself. There was a small candle burning in front of it. The flame was weak and flickering. It looked as though the candle had almost completely burned down. There was only a little wax left. That alone seemed unusual, because we were convinced it hadn't been there earlier. Neither of us remembered seeing any light at all when we entered the cemetery. Curious, I looked at the name carved into the headstone. The moment I read it, I froze. I recognized it immediately. It was my great-grandmother's grave. Out of every grave in that cemetery, somehow we'd ended up standing in front of hers. I hadn't come there looking for it. In fact, I didn't even know exactly where she was buried. Finding it by chance, immediately after using the Ouija board, was enough to leave me speechless. I stood there staring at the headstone, trying to convince myself I had somehow made a mistake. Maybe the name only looked familiar. Maybe I was remembering it incorrectly. I needed to be certain. Right there in the cemetery, I called my mum. When she answered, I explained where I was and asked her to confirm the name on my great-grandmother's grave. She did. It was exactly the same. There was no mistake. I was standing in front of my great-grandmother's headstone. That realization unsettled me far more than anything that had happened with the Ouija board. The board itself could be explained in different ways. Maybe one of us had unknowingly moved the planchette. Maybe we had influenced each other without realizing it. There are reasonable explanations for experiences like that. Finding my great-grandmother's grave by accident was much harder for me to shrug off. Then there was the candle. It was still burning, but only just. The tiny flame flickered in the darkness, as though it was about to go out at any moment. I couldn't stop wondering how we had failed to notice it when we walked into the cemetery. If it had already been burning, surely we should have seen it. If someone had lit it while we were using the Ouija board, we never saw or heard anyone nearby. The whole situation felt strangely timed. Neither of us had any explanation. We stayed there only long enough to collect ourselves before finally leaving. The walk back felt much quieter than the walk in. Neither of us joked anymore. We mostly talked about how unlikely the entire sequence of events had been. Even now, I don't know what to think. I'm open to the possibility that there are perfectly ordinary explanations for everything that happened that night. The movement of the Ouija board could easily have been unconscious. Finding my great-grandmother's grave may have been an extraordinary coincidence. The candle might have been burning the entire time, and perhaps we simply overlooked it on the way in. All of those explanations are possible. At the same time, I can't deny how strange the experience felt while I was living through it. It wasn't just one unusual thing. It was the combination of everything happening in such a short span of time. the moving planchette, the glowing headstone, the nearly burned-out candle, then discovering I was standing in front of my own great-grandmother's grave without ever intending to find it. Whether any of those events were connected, or whether coincidence simply created a story that's impossible for me to forget, I honestly don't know. All I know is that it was enough to completely change the mood of what had started as a harmless experiment between two curious friends. We went to the cemetery expecting a little excitement and maybe a good story to laugh about afterward. Instead, we walked away with a memory that neither of us has ever been able to explain. Even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, the image that comes back most clearly isn't the Ouija board at all. It's that small candle, almost burned down to nothing, quietly flickering in front of my great-grandmother's headstone, as if it had been waiting for us to find it. When I was a teenager, I had an experience with my younger brother that neither of us has ever been able to explain. It wasn't the kind of story where we saw a ghost or watched objects move on their own. In fact, we never actually saw anything at all. What made it so unsettling was that we both experienced exactly the same thing at the same time. It happened in the middle of the night. I was sound asleep when my younger brother woke me up. I remember opening my eyes and seeing him standing in my doorway. He looked genuinely frightened, not the way someone looks after a bad dream or because they heard an odd noise. He seemed convinced that something was seriously wrong. Still half asleep, I asked him what had happened. He hesitated for a second before answering. "There's something in the living room." I frowned, trying to understand what he meant. "What do you mean, something?" He struggled to explain it. Finally, he said, "Like a presence." The way he said it immediately got my attention. He wasn't talking about hearing footsteps or seeing someone break into the house. He couldn't point to anything specific. He simply believed there was something there. He also admitted that he was afraid, not just uneasy. He genuinely thought whatever was in the living room might attack him or someone else in our family. That wasn't like him. He wasn't the type to invent dramatic stories in the middle of the night. Seeing how serious he looked, I decided to get up and check with him. We quietly walked out of my room together and headed toward the living room. The house was silent. Everyone else was asleep. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then we stepped into the living room. The instant we crossed into the room, the temperature seemed to change. At least, that's the only way I know how to describe it. The strange part wasn't that the room itself felt cold. It wasn't like walking into an air-conditioned room or stepping outside during winter. This cold felt different. It seemed to pass straight through me. It wasn't around me, it was inside me. I stopped walking. Without saying anything, I looked over at my brother. Before I could even ask, I could tell from his expression that he was feeling it too. I finally spoke. "Did it suddenly get cold?" He didn't answer out loud. He simply nodded. That silent response somehow made the whole experience even more unsettling. We were both feeling the same thing. A few moments later, another sensation appeared. I suddenly felt an incredible amount of pressure surrounding my body. The closest comparison I can think of is what it might feel like to be buried beneath sand. Not crushed, just surrounded from every direction by something heavy that resisted every movement. It wasn't painful, it was overwhelming. The pressure seemed to come from all around me at once. I looked around the room. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, no movement. The living room looked exactly as it always had. And yet, despite seeing nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The presence my brother had tried to describe suddenly made complete sense. I couldn't see anything, but it felt unmistakably real. It was as though something occupied the room, even though there was nothing visible for my eyes to focus on. The strangest part was that it didn't feel stationary. Both of us had the distinct impression that whatever we were sensing was moving, not walking, more like flowing, almost as though an invisible mass was quietly shifting from one area of the room to another. Neither of us said very much. There didn't seem to be anything useful to say. We both already knew what the other was experiencing. Eventually, we decided to pray. It wasn't a dramatic moment. We simply stood there together and prayed. Then we told whatever might have been there that it needed to leave. Whether that actually changed anything or not, I honestly can't say with certainty. The heavy feeling seemed to lessen. The pressure wasn't quite as overwhelming afterward. The room no longer felt quite as oppressive. Even so, the strange sensation didn't disappear completely. Enough of it remained that neither of us felt comfortable staying there. Instead, we decided to leave. We walked to the room farthest away from the living room. Neither of us wanted to spend the rest of the night anywhere near whatever we believed we'd experienced. Eventually, we lay down and tried to fall asleep again. I'm not sure either of us slept particularly well. The next morning, everything seemed completely normal. The living room looked exactly the same. The strange cold was gone. The overwhelming pressure had vanished. There was nothing visible to explain what had happened during the night. Over the years, I've thought about that experience many times. I've considered every ordinary explanation I can think of. Perhaps we influenced each other without realizing it. Maybe my brother's fear affected my own perception after he woke me up. Perhaps we both interpreted perfectly ordinary sensations in an unusual way because it was 2 o'clock in the morning. Those explanations are certainly possible. The human mind is remarkably powerful. Fear can shape the way we experience our surroundings. At the same time, one detail continues to stand out. I noticed the cold before my brother said anything about it. When I asked whether he felt it too, he simply nodded. We didn't compare notes beforehand. We didn't describe the sensations to each other until we were already experiencing them. That shared experience has always been the hardest part for me to dismiss. I've never seen a ghost. I've never watched furniture move on its own. I've never experienced anything else quite like that night. It remains completely unique. Even now, I don't claim to know what happened. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation hidden somewhere in memory, psychology, or the environment. Maybe two frightened siblings unknowingly reinforced each other's perceptions. Or maybe we encountered something neither of us understood. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that, after all these years, I still remember exactly how that room felt the moment we stepped inside. I remember the impossible cold that seemed to settle somewhere beneath my skin instead of in the air around me. I remember the invisible weight pressing in from every direction, and the unmistakable feeling that something unseen was quietly moving through the room beside us. Whether it was fear, coincidence, or something far more difficult to explain, it remains one of the few experiences in my life that has never found a satisfying answer. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, I don't remember seeing anything at all. I only remember the overwhelming certainty that something unseen was there with us. I think I was around 10 or 11 years old when this happened. It wasn't a dramatic experience, and compared to some of the stories people tell, it probably doesn't sound especially terrifying. But I was just a kid at the time, and for me, it was one of the most frightening moments I can remember. Even now, I still think about it from time to time. It happened one evening, sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock. My parents had told me it was time for bed, so I went to my room like I usually did. There wasn't anything unusual about that night. It had been an ordinary day, and I expected the evening to end the same way every other school night did. I climbed into bed, pulled the blanket over myself, and tried to fall asleep. The room was quiet. There wasn't any television on. I don't remember hearing anyone moving around the house. Everything felt completely normal. For a while, I just lay there with my eyes closed, waiting for sleep to come. Then I heard it, right above my head. Someone was breathing. Not soft breathing, not the faint sound of air moving through the room. It was slow, heavy breathing, as though someone was standing directly over my bed. The sound was close enough that it felt like whoever, or whatever, it belonged to, was only inches above me. The moment I realized what I was hearing, my entire body froze. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. For a second, I wondered whether I was somehow hearing my own breathing differently than usual. To test that idea, I focused completely on my own breath. I listened carefully. The sound above me continued. Then I held my breath. For a brief moment, I stopped breathing entirely. I wanted to see whether the other breathing would stop too. It didn't. The heavy breathing continued exactly the same. Slow, steady, unmistakably separate from my own. That realization frightened me more than anything else. If it wasn't me, then what was making the sound? I stayed completely still. I didn't call for my parents. I didn't pull the blanket over my head. I simply lay there listening. Time seemed to slow down. In reality, it was probably only about a minute. To a child lying alone in a dark bedroom, though, it felt much longer. Every breath seemed to echo through the room. I kept expecting something else to happen. For the breathing to get louder. For someone to touch me. For a voice to speak. None of that happened. The breathing simply continued above me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence afterward felt almost as strange as the sound itself. I stayed frozen for another moment, trying to decide whether I had imagined the whole thing. Finally, I worked up enough courage to move. I slowly turned around to look. There was nothing there. No person. No shadow. Nothing standing over my bed. The room looked exactly the way it always had. I searched the area with my eyes, expecting to find something that could explain what I'd heard. There was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself there was no point in continuing to stare into the darkness. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, everything was completely normal. I never found any explanation for what happened that night. As I've gotten older, I've considered plenty of possibilities. Maybe I was beginning to fall asleep and experience some kind of auditory hallucination. Maybe sounds from somewhere else in the house seemed much closer than they actually were. Maybe there was a completely ordinary source for the breathing that I simply couldn't identify as a child. All of those explanations seem possible. Even so, the memory has stayed surprisingly clear. What I remember most isn't seeing anything frightening. It's the sound, the steady rhythm of heavy breathing directly above my head. The moment I held my own breath and realized the other breathing hadn't stopped. The feeling of lying perfectly still, too afraid to move until the sound finally faded away on its own. Compared to many other unexplained stories, this one is fairly simple. Nothing appeared. Nothing touched me. Nothing moved around the room. It was only a sound. But sometimes, a single unexplained sound is enough to leave a lasting impression, especially when you're a child lying alone in the dark. Even now, I can't say for certain what caused it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that I've simply never discovered. Or maybe it was one of those strange moments that never quite fits into an ordinary explanation. I honestly don't know. All I know is that, after all these years, I can still remember lying in that quiet bedroom, listening to slow, heavy breathing coming from somewhere directly above me, while I stayed perfectly still beneath the covers. When the sound finally stopped, and I gathered the courage to turn around, there was nothing there at all. Whatever caused it, that brief moment was enough to stay with me long after I stopped being afraid of the dark. There were several strange things that happened in the same house over the years. None of them were especially dramatic on their own, and I've never been able to prove that any of them were paranormal. Even now, I still go back and forth between looking for logical explanations and wondering if there was something unusual about that place. One experience happened over and over again. Every so often, usually late at night, I'd suddenly feel an intense fluttering sensation in my left temple. It wasn't just a slight twitch. It actually hurt, and I could feel it moving much more than what seemed normal. Along with the pain came a strange sound. The only way I can describe it is as a kind of squelching noise, almost as though something was shifting or pulsing inside my head. At first, I honestly worried there was something seriously wrong with me. I wondered if I was having some kind of medical problem, maybe even an aneurysm or something equally serious. I had no real reason to think that other than how strange the sensation felt. Then something happened that made the experience much harder to dismiss. While my temple throbbed and that strange sound continued, I would hear a woman laughing. Not quietly, not somewhere outside the house. It sounded loud and unmistakable. The laughter never seemed to come from a specific direction. It simply filled the silence around me. Almost every time it happened, I was either completely alone or everyone else in the house was already asleep. The television wasn't on. The radio wasn't playing. There were no conversations happening anywhere nearby. The house would be completely still except for that loud laughter. I never saw anyone. I never found any source for the sound. Eventually, I started wondering whether the laughter wasn't actually happening at all. Maybe whatever was causing the pain in my temple was also causing auditory hallucinations. That honestly seemed like the most reasonable explanation. As unsettling as it was, I figured there had to be something physical behind it, rather than anything supernatural. Still, I never found out exactly what caused those episodes. Years later, while we were still living in the same house, my younger half-sister moved in. Almost immediately, something else began happening that everyone noticed. She somehow managed to lock herself out of her bedroom all the time. She was naturally a little accident-prone, so at first nobody thought much of it. We assumed she simply kept forgetting her keys or accidentally locking the door behind herself. It became almost routine. Then one afternoon, something happened that made the situation seem much stranger. I had bought her a comic book as a small gift. She wasn't home when I arrived, but I wanted to leave it on her bed so she'd find it when she got back. The problem was that her bedroom door was locked. Since I couldn't get inside, I slid the comic underneath the door instead. I watched it disappear beneath the gap and slide well into the room. It went far enough that I knew it couldn't simply slide back out on its own. With that done, I left the house and went over to a neighbor's place to hang out for a while. While I was there, I noticed some Pokemon wrapping paper. I thought it would make the comic a much nicer gift if I wrapped it first. So I decided to go back home, retrieve the comic, wrap it, and then leave it in her room properly. I wasn't gone very long, maybe 20 minutes. When I got back, the house was exactly as I'd left it. The front door was still locked. Nobody else had come home. I walked down the hallway toward my sister's room. That's when I stopped. The comic book was lying in the middle of the hallway. Not inside her bedroom, not partly under the door. Right there in the hallway. I stared at it for a moment, trying to understand what I was looking at. Her bedroom door was still locked, exactly as it had been before. There was no obvious way for the comic to have come back out into the hallway by itself. I picked it up, still trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Eventually, I decided not to overthink it. I wrapped the comic with the Pokemon paper, just like I'd planned. This time, instead of sliding it under the door, I unlocked the bedroom myself. I walked inside, placed the wrapped gift on her bed, and left the room. I know for a fact that I didn't lock the door again when I came out. I had no reason to. Later that evening, my sister came home. Almost immediately, I heard her complaining. She was annoyed because her bedroom door was locked again. I didn't really know what to say. I knew I had left it unlocked. There wasn't anyone else in the house who could have locked it afterward. It was one of those small things that never made any sense. It wasn't frightening, just confusing. Then there was another incident from that same house. One day I was home alone while my dad was at work. The house was completely quiet. Without warning, I heard a man's voice shout from my dad's bedroom, very loudly. Oh shit! It sounded exactly like someone reacting to something unexpected. The voice was clear enough that I immediately assumed someone was actually inside the room. My first thought was that maybe my dad's girlfriend was there with someone else. I walked toward the bedroom expecting to find another person. There was no one. The room was empty. The house was empty. I was completely alone. Later, when my dad got home, I told him what I'd heard. He laughed it off. To him, it wasn't worth thinking about. Life simply carried on. Looking back now, I still don't know how to explain any of those experiences. The laughter during the episodes with my temple could have had a medical explanation. The comic book might have somehow shifted in a way that only seemed impossible, although I still can't picture how. The locked bedroom door may have had a faulty lock that behaved unpredictably. The voice from my dad's room could have been a sound from outside that somehow echoed through the house in a strange way. Every one of those explanations is possible. I generally prefer ordinary explanations whenever I can find them. At the same time, what makes these memories linger is how many unusual things happened in that same house over the years. None of them were dramatic enough to convince me beyond doubt that anything paranormal was happening. None of them provided clear evidence of ghosts or spirits. Instead, they were simply odd moments that never fit comfortably into any explanation I could come up with. Even now, when I think back on that house, I don't remember a single terrifying event. I remember a collection of strange experiences that quietly accumulated over time. A woman's laughter echoing through an otherwise silent home while my temple throbbed. A comic book somehow finding its way back into the hallway from behind a locked door. A bedroom that seemed determined to lock itself, and a man's voice loudly shouting from an empty room while I was completely alone. Maybe each incident had its own perfectly ordinary cause. Maybe they were all unrelated coincidences, or maybe there was something about that old house that I'll never fully understand. Whatever the truth is, those memories have stayed with me far longer than I ever expected. When I was younger, my family lived in a very small flat that always made me feel uneasy. Looking back now, I can't say for certain whether anything paranormal ever happened there, or whether I was simply a child with an overactive imagination. Even so, there are a handful of memories from that place that have stayed with me for years. The building only had 2 floors. There was one flat downstairs and another upstairs, each with its own separate front door. We lived in the upstairs flat. Outside the front of the building were several enormous trees. Their branches had grown so high that they almost reached our windows. From inside the flat, it often felt as though the trees surrounded us, and they blocked out a surprising amount of light. The whole place always felt strange to me. It wasn't that I saw ghosts or anything dramatic. It was simply a constant feeling that someone else was there. Even as a child, I never felt completely comfortable inside that flat. For reasons I couldn't explain, I became desperate to leave. Fortunately, we had never planned to stay there forever. My family intended to move as soon as we could. The strange part was that every time it seemed like we were finally about to move, something would happen that stopped it. Plans would fall through. Something unexpected would delay everything. As a child, I started creating my own explanation. I convinced myself the flat didn't want us to leave. I genuinely believed it was somehow keeping us there. The longer we stayed, the stronger that fear became. Eventually, I even started worrying that we'd be trapped there forever. Looking back now, I know that wasn't true. We eventually did move out. The fact that we left proved my childhood belief completely wrong. Still, while we lived there, several odd things happened that I never completely understood. One of the most common was that objects seemed to disappear. Not just once. It happened often enough that I remember thinking about it even as a child. I had a small toy cleaning set made of plastic. I never really played with it anymore, but I always kept it in the same place. There was a narrow gap between my toy box and my chest of drawers, and that's where it stayed. One day, it simply disappeared. At first, I assumed I'd moved it somewhere else without remembering. I searched everywhere, behind furniture, inside cupboards, under the bed. Everywhere I could think of, it was gone. Months passed. I eventually accepted that it had somehow been lost. Then one day my cousin found it. It was sitting exactly where it had always been, right there in the narrow gap between the toy box and the drawers. The same place I'd searched repeatedly. I know memories aren't always perfect, but I still remember how certain I was that it hadn't been there. Finding it back in its original place genuinely unsettled me. Another strange disappearance involved a tablet. One day I placed it on my bed before leaving my room for a short time. When I came back, I didn't immediately notice anything unusual. Then I realized the tablet was gone. It had completely vanished. Unlike the toy, it never reappeared. To this day, nobody knows where it went. Part of me suspects my mom might have moved it for some reason. That honestly seems like the most likely explanation. The strange part is that she has always denied knowing anything about it. She and I were the only people in the flat at the time. At least, we were supposed to be. Even years later, little reminders of that missing tablet still exist. We still have the charger. We still have another case that belonged to it. We still have the original box it came in. Oddly enough, whenever I search my email account, that old tablet is often one of the only devices that still appears connected to it somehow, even though it disappeared long ago. It's probably nothing more than old account information that was never fully removed. Even so, it always reminds me of the mystery. Then there were the footsteps. Almost every night, I'd hear someone walking outside my bedroom. The sounds always seemed to come from the hallway just beyond my door. As a child, I built an image in my mind of what I imagined was making those footsteps. I pictured a little girl. She had long black hair hanging over her face. She wore a white dress. Whether that image came from my imagination, stories I'd heard, or something else entirely, I have no idea. I never actually saw her, but every time I heard those footsteps, that was exactly what I pictured standing outside my room. Because of that, I hated leaving my bedroom door open. If someone forgot to close it before bedtime, I'd become incredibly anxious. I couldn't stop imagining someone standing silently in the doorway, just outside my room. Nothing was ever there. The fear existed entirely in my own mind. Still, it felt very real at the time. There was one part of my bedroom that strangely never frightened me. An old cellar. For whatever reason, I never thought it was creepy. It was simply part of the room. One day, though, something happened that I've never been able to explain. I started hearing music coming from the cellar, not random music. My favorite songs, the music sounded as though it was coming from somewhere below. There wasn't a radio down there. There wasn't a television. There wasn't anything capable of playing music. Yet I could clearly hear the songs. The strangest part was that they weren't especially popular anymore. It wasn't the sort of music I would expect someone nearby to be playing. At that age, I didn't find it frightening. In fact, I was actually happy to hear it. I didn't really question it very much. Only later did I start wondering where the music could possibly have come from. Of course, there are ordinary explanations. Perhaps someone outside was playing music and the sound traveled in an unusual way. Old buildings often carry sound through walls, floors, and pipes in unexpected directions. That's entirely possible. Still, it always seemed unlikely to me. The neighboring house wasn't directly against my bedroom wall. Between my room and theirs were other parts of the building. The wall beside my room mainly bordered the staircase rather than another living space. Because of that, hearing neighbors so clearly never seemed very convincing. The footsteps also never sounded like they came from downstairs. They always seemed to be immediately outside my bedroom. Again, perhaps acoustics in an old building simply fooled me. Children also have vivid imaginations. Fear has a remarkable way of filling in details that aren't actually there, pescant. I know that now. When I look back on everything that happened in that flat, I honestly don't know what to believe. Maybe every single experience had a perfectly ordinary explanation. Objects get misplaced. Children imagine frightening things. Old buildings make unusual noises. Sounds travel in strange ways. Those explanations are all reasonable. At the same time, living there always left me with the feeling that the flat itself was somehow different. Not dangerous, just unsettling. Even after all these years, I still remember the enormous trees outside the upstairs windows, the quiet hall outside my bedroom, the footsteps I could never explain, the toy that disappeared only to return exactly where it belonged, the tablet that vanished without a trace, and the unexpected sound of my favorite songs drifting up from a cellar that had no radio at all. Maybe it was simply the way a child's imagination transformed an old house into something mysterious. Maybe the strange atmosphere encouraged me to connect ordinary events into something much larger than they really were. Or maybe there are some places that quietly leave an impression on the people who live there without ever revealing why. Whatever the truth is, that little upstairs flat remains one of the strangest places I've ever called home, and even now I sometimes wonder how much of what I remember came from the house itself, and how much came from being a child trying to make sense of a place that never quite felt ordinary. I was 12 years old when this happened, and it's still one of the clearest memories I have from my childhood. I was home alone that afternoon, sitting in my mom's bedroom watching television. It was winter, and outside everything was quiet. Inside the apartment, the only sound was the TV playing in the background. There was nothing unusual about the day. I was completely relaxed, enjoying having the place to myself while waiting for everyone else to come home. Then I heard it. Click, a single sharp sound. It sounded exactly like the heel of a woman's shoe striking the tiled floor. Just one step. Nothing else followed. I looked away from the television for a moment and listened. Silence. Several minutes passed. I started convincing myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been a sound from outside. Maybe the television had made a similar noise. It didn't seem important anymore. Then I heard it again. Click. Another single step. Exactly the same sound. It immediately reminded me of my mom's shoes. She wore high heels almost every day, and after hearing them so often, I knew that sound instantly. My first thought was that she must have come home early. For a moment, I felt relieved, but almost as quickly, something didn't seem right. I hadn't heard the front door. That was impossible to ignore. During winter, our front door was difficult to close properly. You had to push it with quite a bit of force until it finally latched. Whenever someone came home, everyone in the apartment heard it. There was simply no quiet way to shut that door. Yet I hadn't heard it open. I hadn't heard it close. Just those isolated footsteps. Still trying to find a reasonable explanation, I picked up the phone and called my mom. She didn't answer. That made me even more uncertain. Maybe she was driving. Maybe she was still at work. Maybe I'd simply imagined the sound after all. I put the phone down and tried to focus on the television again. A few more minutes passed. Then I heard it. Click, another single step. This time it sounded closer. I sat perfectly still. The apartment was completely silent again. Then another step. Click. A pause. Another. The footsteps had a strange rhythm. There was a long silence between every step, almost as though whoever was walking was deliberately taking their time. I stopped paying attention to the television entirely. Every bit of my attention shifted toward the hallway. To reach my mom's bedroom from the entrance, someone had to walk through the kitchen and then down the hallway. That's exactly where the footsteps seemed to be coming from. Slowly, very slowly. Click. A pause. Click. Each step sounded a little closer than the last. I could almost picture someone making their way through the apartment, one careful step at a time. There was still no sound of the front door, no voices, no keys, nothing except those heels striking the floor. The bedroom door was open. I found myself staring toward the doorway without really wanting to. A part of me desperately wanted someone familiar to appear. Another part of me didn't want to see anyone at all. The footsteps continued. Click. Pause. Click. By then, they sounded as though they were already in the hallway, just outside the bedroom. I couldn't bring myself to look. Instead, I pulled the blanket over myself and hid underneath it. It probably wasn't the smartest reaction, but I was only 12 years old. At that moment, hiding felt like the only thing I could do. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps came closer. Click. Pause. Click. Then, nothing. The sound stopped. It felt as though whoever had been walking was standing right at the bedroom doorway. Waiting, I stayed completely still beneath the blanket. I don't know how long I remained there. Probably only a few seconds. It felt much longer. Then the footsteps started again. Only this time they were moving away. Click. A long pause. Click. Another pause. Each step became slightly more distant. They seemed to retrace the exact same path back through the hallway toward the kitchen. Then they stopped completely. The apartment fell silent. I didn't come out from under the blanket right away. I was far too frightened. I stayed exactly where I was, listening for any sound that might tell me someone was still inside the apartment. Nothing. No more footsteps. No doors opening. No voices. Nothing at all. Even after the silence returned, I couldn't convince myself it was safe. I remained in my mom's room for the rest of the day. I refused to leave. Eventually, evening came, and the rest of my family finally returned home. The apartment was exactly as they had left it. The front door was still locked. There was no sign that anyone had entered while I was alone. I told them what I'd heard. Naturally, no one could explain it. Over the years, I've tried to come up with ordinary explanations. Old buildings make strange noises. Pipes expand and contract. Neighbors can create sounds that seem much closer than they really are. Perhaps the acoustics of the apartment made distant footsteps seem as though they were inside our home. All of those explanations seem possible. At the same time, one detail has always stayed with me. The rhythm. Those weren't random creaks. They sounded exactly like someone wearing high heels. One distinct step, a long pause, then another, slowly approaching my mother's bedroom before stopping at the open doorway, then turning around and leaving the same way. Nothing like that ever happened again. Not before that day, not afterward. It remains a single unexplained memory from my childhood. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary cause that I never discovered. Maybe my imagination filled in details after hearing a few isolated sounds. Or maybe I experienced something I'll never fully understand. I honestly don't know. All I know is that even now I can still remember sitting alone in my mother's room on that quiet winter afternoon, listening to the unmistakable sound of high heels slowly crossing the apartment, one deliberate step at a time. I remember the growing certainty that whoever or whatever was making those footsteps was heading straight for the open bedroom door. And I remember the overwhelming relief when the steps finally turned away, leaving nothing behind except a silent apartment and a frightened 12-year-old who refused to leave that room until the rest of the family came home. I grew up in a house that had been built in the early 1900s. It was one of those old homes that seemed to have its own personality. The floors creaked, the rooms felt different from modern houses, and there was always a certain atmosphere that came with living somewhere so old. The kitchen had a large hanging chandelier-style light fixture that had probably been there for years. It hung directly over the middle of the room and was something I barely noticed anymore because I'd grown up seeing it every day. This happened when I was a freshman in high school. One evening, a friend came over to my house, and the two of us had gotten pretty stoned. I'm mentioning that because it's an important part of the story, and I've always considered the possibility that it affected what we experienced. We were standing in the kitchen, just talking about random things. Nothing unusual had happened up to that point. The room was brightly lit by the chandelier overhead, and the rest of the house was quiet. As we stood there talking, I started noticing something strange out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't a clear figure. It was more like movement. Shadows seemed to be shifting just beyond my peripheral vision. Every time I tried to look directly at them, there was nothing there. At first, I assumed it was just my imagination. Then I noticed my friend suddenly stopped talking. He had the same expression I probably did. He was staring toward another part of the kitchen as if he'd noticed something too. Before I could even ask him what was wrong, he reacted. Without saying a word, he turned and ran out of the kitchen. Seeing him panic immediately made me panic too. Until that moment, I'd been trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The fact that he'd apparently seen something at the same time completely changed that. I didn't stop to ask questions. I just ran after him. As I was running out of the kitchen, something happened behind me. The light in the chandelier suddenly exploded. It wasn't like the entire fixture shattered. The glass didn't rain down from the ceiling. Instead, it sounded like the bulb blew out or shorted. For a split second, the entire room lit up with an incredibly bright flash. Then the light was gone, The timing couldn't have been stranger. One moment we were both rushing toward the doorway. The next there was a loud pop and a brilliant burst of light behind us. We didn't stop running. Once we were out of the kitchen, we both just stood there trying to catch our breath. Neither of us really knew what to say. The first thing we did was compare what we'd experienced. I asked him why he'd run. He admitted he'd noticed something moving in the kitchen that he couldn't explain. I told him I'd seen strange shadows in my peripheral vision just before he bolted. Neither of us had mentioned seeing anything until after we'd left the room. That was the part that stayed with me. If I'd been alone, I probably would have blamed everything on being high. Even the blown light bulb could have simply been an unfortunate coincidence. Old light bulbs burn out. Electrical problems happen, especially in older houses. The house itself was nearly a century old at that point, so there are plenty of perfectly reasonable explanations for a bulb suddenly failing. I've always recognized that. At the same time, it's difficult to ignore the sequence of events. Both of us independently noticed something unusual. My friend reacted first. I followed him. Then, almost the instant we crossed the doorway, the chandelier bulb failed with a loud pop and an intense flash. I've replayed that night in my mind many times over the years. Being under the influence certainly could have affected our perception. Our brains might have interpreted ordinary shadows as movement. One person reacting suddenly could easily have caused the other to panic as well. Those explanations honestly make sense. But even allowing for all of that, the timing of the light blowing out has always felt strangely memorable. Whether it was nothing more than an aging electrical fixture choosing the worst possible moment to fail, or simply a coincidence that happened to occur after two frightened teenagers worked themselves into a panic, I can't say for certain. I don't claim that we witnessed anything paranormal. I only know that for a few unforgettable seconds in that old kitchen, we both felt as though something was there, just beyond the edge of our vision. Then, as we ran for the door, the chandelier erupted in a brilliant flash before going dark, leaving us standing outside the room, wondering whether we'd experienced an ordinary electrical failure at exactly the wrong moment, or something neither of us has ever been able to fully explain. One summer, I spent a few days visiting one of my closest friends who lived about 3 hours away from me. It had become a pretty normal tradition. Whenever we had time off, I'd make the drive to his place, we'd hang out for a couple of days, and then I'd head home. On this particular trip, we decided to drink. What started as a few drinks turned into way too many. By the end of the night, we were both completely blackout drunk. Neither of us remembers much after a certain point. Eventually, my friend stumbled upstairs to his bedroom while I stayed downstairs and crashed on the couch in his basement. The next thing I clearly remember is waking up sometime during the night. I checked the clock. It was around 3 in the morning. I desperately needed to use the bathroom. To this day, I have no idea how I managed to find it in the dark, while still half asleep and incredibly hungover, but somehow I did. I used the bathroom, went straight back to the basement, lay down on the couch, and fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke again, it was around 10 that morning. Everything seemed completely normal. My friend was awake by then, and we laughed about how terrible we both felt after drinking so much the night before. Neither of us remembered much from the evening, but that wasn't exactly surprising. We eventually went out for breakfast, spent the rest of the day hanging out, and by late afternoon, I decided it was time to head home. I left his house at around 5 o'clock and made the 3-hour drive back. Nothing unusual happened during the trip. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, though, something immediately felt strange. Both of my parents looked genuinely confused when they saw me, not surprised that I'd come home. Confused, I asked them what was wrong. Instead of answering my question, they asked me one of their own. Why did you come home in the middle of the night and then leave again? I just stared at them. At first, I honestly thought they were joking. The idea didn't even make sense. Driving 3 hours home in the middle of the night, only to turn around and drive 3 hours back before morning, would have been completely ridiculous. I told them that. They looked at each other. Then they explained what they believed had happened. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, they'd both been awakened by noises coming from the kitchen. They heard someone moving around downstairs. Thinking maybe one of them had accidentally left something out, they got up to see what was going on. When they looked into the kitchen, they said they saw me. According to both of them, I was standing at the stove eating something. After that, I took a drink. One of them called my name. They expected me to answer. Instead, they said I simply turned and calmly walked away toward my old bedroom. Acting as though nothing was unusual, they assumed I'd unexpectedly come home during the night and gone straight to bed afterward. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told them I'd never left my friend's house. As far as I knew, I'd been asleep on his basement couch the entire night, except for waking briefly to use the bathroom. They weren't convinced. From their perspective, they'd both seen me, so I asked them something that only someone who had actually seen me should have known. What was I wearing? Without hesitation, they described my clothes exactly. Every item matched what I'd been wearing the night before at my friend's house. The same shirt, the same pants, everything. That answer completely caught me off guard. There was no reason they should have guessed correctly. They hadn't seen me since I'd left for my friend's house, yet somehow they described exactly what I was wearing. For a while, all of us just sat there, trying to make sense of it. The timeline simply didn't work. If I'd really been at my parents' house at 2 or 3 in the morning, I couldn't also have been waking up in my friend's basement around the same time. The drive alone made that impossible. 3 hours each way. There wasn't enough time. I've spent years thinking about what might explain it. The simplest possibility is that my parents were mistaken. Maybe they woke up half asleep and briefly misidentified someone or misunderstood what they were seeing. Memory can be surprisingly unreliable, especially when people are awakened suddenly in the middle of the night. That's certainly possible. At the same time, they both remembered the same thing. They both insisted it was me. They both remembered me standing in the kitchen. And they both accurately described the clothes I had been wearing. I've also wondered whether my own memory failed because of how drunk I'd been. Blackouts can erase hours of time. But even then, the distances don't add up. There simply wasn't enough time for me to drive home, appear in my parents' kitchen, drive back to my friend's house, and wake up there around 3 in the morning. No matter how I try to arrange the timeline, it doesn't fit. I don't claim to know what happened. I don't even have a theory that completely satisfies me. All I know is that my memory says I spent the entire night at my friend's house, while my parents remain just as certain that they saw me quietly walk through our kitchen hundreds of miles away. Whether one of us was mistaken, whether memory played strange tricks on all of us, or whether something happened that none of us can explain, I honestly don't know. But of all the strange stories I've collected over the years, this is the one that has always bothered me the most. Because it leaves behind one simple question that has never had a satisfying answer. If I was asleep on a basement couch 3 hours away, who did my parents see standing in their kitchen that night? Some of you will fall asleep right here, mid-sentence, and that's exactly how it should be. Others will lie there a little longer, thinking about what you just heard. Either way, I'm glad you spent this time with Sleepy Shadows. If you want to come back for more, subscribing keeps the light on for you. Sleep well tonight.